Good morning, everybody. All right, Romans chapter 1. Let's keep going in this. This has been a challenging series to preach through Romans 1 for multiple reasons, one of which being is because it's so heavy, and it's supposed to be. It's intended to be. It's supposed to point out to us. And I love the fact that this week's sermon, I love the way Paul structures the book of Romans. For what happens in 28 through 32 to follow up with what we talked about last week is so practical. And I'll tell you why by telling you a story. When I worked many years ago in Raleigh, North Carolina, I worked as a landscaper, particularly working on athletic fields, soccer fields. And we had built from scratch a brand new soccer field up there. Now, something you should know about Wake County, Raleigh, North Carolina, is it's one of the most rich granite places in the world. In other words, there are more granite mines in Raleigh and in Wake County than there are almost anywhere else in the world, which is great unless you're trying to plant something, because everything you're trying to plant finds itself to be full of rocks. That's right. And so we blasted rocks, we moved rocks, truckloads full of rocks, brought in dirt, smoothed everything out, rolled out sod, because you don't really wait for Bermuda to grow. That's not good. And so we rolled the sod out. Everything looks great for about 3 months. And we get in the middle of soccer season, and the next thing you know, there are these yellow, almost perfect, circular spots. And so the whole soccer field was green with yellow polka dots, which I thought was pretty cool, but the soccer players didn't seem to agree. And so we were like, well, what's wrong? So we bring in a turf expert who does all kinds of analysis. There's nothing wrong with the turf. There's nothing wrong with the dirt. So there's only one way to figure out what's going on, and that is to dig up the grass and dig up underneath. And when we dug up underneath all those perfect little circles, guess what we found? Rock everywhere, because we had spent a lot of time really getting the big rocks up. But the work of getting the little rocks up just didn't happen. And then I don't know that we could have done enough to get rid of them, but there's a real helpful illustration in understanding the Christian life. When we think about last week and the issues that we discussed last week, we think of those things like big rocks. And the reality is that the Lord has saved us, many of us, from these big rocks, whether it be addiction or sexual sin or things like that. There are things that God has delivered us from, and we see this immediate change, and we're thankful for that. We're raised from death to life, and that is what it means to become a Christian. But sometimes we get a little complacent. And whereas we should, when God clears out the big rocks, we should do the work. This is Paul, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. We should do the work of removing the little rocks in our lives, but instead, we just try to kind of plant something over them. And then we wonder why our life goes haywire. Jerry Bridges calls this in his book, aptly titled, Respectable Sins. There are certain sins that you can commit in the Christian life that we all feel pretty quickly that we can justify ourselves for having committed them. And nothing is easier for us to do than to read a passage like we read last week, to think about the concepts that we thought about last week and think we're doing pretty good when compared to those people. And it's almost like Paul knew we were going to do that, isn't it? Because right after that, we get a list of 21 sins that indict every single one of us. Every single one of us. Why? Because he wants us to understand there's no such thing as a little sin. And I wonder sometimes, I fear sometimes that the response, I've never heard anybody say this to me, but I fear sometimes that there will be people who listen to our preaching and listen to what we say as we disciple, as we think about sin, and they'll say, why are you making little sin such a big deal? Why are you making so much of a mess over something that's so small? And there's really one reason, there's really one answer, is because there's no such thing as a small sin to Paul. Now, I'm not saying all sins are equal. We've talked about that. There are certainly some sins that will incur stricter judgment. You can look at James 3:1. If I teach you falsely, I incur stricter judgment. I don't know what that means, but it sounds pretty scary. So I'm going to try real hard to not teach you falsely, right? But it does mean that every sin is grievous, and every sin deserves what we're going to see at the end is God's righteous decree. And as Paul is helping us, protecting us in these 4 verses from self-righteousness, he's going to show us one more time this pattern that sin takes in our lives. The way we're going to break it down today is we're going to call it distortion, possession, commission. Distortion, possession, commission. Those 3. I'm going to walk through those a little bit at a time, so if you don't want to write them down at the beginning, we'll get to them. But I want us to see this. Ultimately, all sin is untamable. It must be killed. It cannot be tamed. And that's what Paul wants us to see in this passage. So let's just start with the first verse, verse 28. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. So the first one is distortion. Sin distorts. What's wrong with the little sins in your life? The little sins that you tolerate in your life will distort the trajectory of your life forever. They will change who you are. They will change your trajectory. Remember, this is all building on who is the they, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God. He's talking about all of us, either who we were or who we are, right? It goes all the way back to verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and wickedness of evil men who in their unrighteousness suppress the truth. That is the they. And everything is built off of verse 18. This whole passage is together. There's just so much stuff we couldn't talk about it all at one time. And so he's saying now they didn't see fit to even acknowledge God. Now isn't that totally what all of us are prone to do and what we see happening in the world around us? In spite of the revelation of God, we don't acknowledge Him. We talked about this in verses 19 and verse 20, that what can be known about God is plain because God has revealed it to him, because His eternal attributes, Paul says, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen from the things that they have been made, so that they are without excuse. In other words, we look around and see God. It's not that we don't see Him, it's that we suppress Him. But He will not be suppressed. His revelation abounds. It's the equivalent of walking outside on a hot summer day and taking your hand and putting it up against the sun and thinking that somehow you made the sun stop shining because you put your hand up. We're suppressing the truth, but the truth is there. The heat is all around us. We feel the reality of the presence of God, and yet we reject it in spite of the fact that He's graciously revealed Himself to us. In spite of the fact that He's given us great grace, we reject the truth. He has given all of us common grace. The sinner, the non-believer, the Christian, all of us have common grace. A steak tastes the same to a Christian and a non-Christian. And that is the grace of God by which that is true. He allows even His worst enemies to experience good things in this world. And in spite of that, we don't acknowledge Him. In spite of the fact that every good gift that you have in your life came from God, there has been a time in all of your lives and in my life where we've been ungrateful. Christians should be the most grateful people in the world. And yet ungratefulness is so much easier to seat itself in my heart, isn't it? Like it's true. It's the things that we can overlook that we don't have, the things that we overlook that we have because of the things we don't have abound. And so it becomes easy for us to just refuse to acknowledge God, right? In spite of the freedom that He has purchased for us. Let me explain to you, in case you've never heard. I think you have if you've been in here. Let me explain exactly what God did for you on the cross of Christ. On the cross of Christ, Jesus Christ bore the wrath that you deserved for the sins that you committed. The perfect, sinless, spotless Son of God bore the wrath of God for you. And not only did He forgive you, He declared you righteous and set you free to serve Him, which is what you were created to do in the first place. When you think about the gospel in that way, how atrocious does the question, what's wrong with a little sin, sound? Which of the sins that you have committed do you think that Jesus was okay with bearing on His body? Which of the sins that you commit or that you're prone to commit, whether it be ungratefulness or materialism or bitterness, which of those sins do you think it's just okay? Jesus kind of went, oh, it's okay. No big deal. The cross stands for us as an indictment against the very worst of our little respectable sins. And in spite of the freedom you have been given, set free to do works of righteousness which He has prepared beforehand, in spite of that, we still want to run back to the thing that enslaved us. I say, well, it's okay to tell a little white lie here and there. It's all right to gossip every once in a while. It can't be a big thing, right? It's okay to overeat if I'm really hungry. Got to be careful. We're all Baptist, right? But truly, that's what do? We run back. It's Isaiah likens it to a dog that runs back to his own vomit. That's what we do. You think about it. The very thing that made you sick, that you expelled from your body, you will run back and eat because of the sin that lives in us. And in spite of all of that, in spite of the freedom, so when Paul says they did not see fit to acknowledge God, in other words, in spite of all of this, they did not see fit to acknowledge Him, so what does He do? He gave them up to a debased, a depraved mind to do what ought not be done. That word depraved can also be translated, and I think it might even be better translated, counterfeit. He gave them up to a counterfeit mind. It was the word that was used for the counterfeit silver coins that were put into the economy of the Roman Empire. Same word, right? He gave them over to a counterfeit mind. Why? Because you exchanged the truth of God for a lie. The things that you believe in your life that are true are counterfeit. The identities that you try to place in yourself, the idea of I am what I feel. We talked about this last week. The fact that we would place our identity in how we feel is a clear example of the fact that you are intentionally buying something that is counterfeit. The fact that you would believe that there are things that somehow take priority over the things of God in your life are demonstrative of the fact that you are buying into a counterfeit mind. That we are buying into a counterfeit mind. And so he says, you don't see fit to acknowledge God? Fine. Take your funny money and go do what you want. And that's that God gave them over. And so we use fake currency in our own souls to buy fake truth that the evil one is selling, the world, the flesh, and the devil are saying. And then we wonder why our lives are destroyed. We wonder why we're totally tanked. Because you bought a lie way back there with counterfeit stuff in your own mind. And you came all the way down here and it's been distorted. And how many lies of the evil one does it take in order to distort your life? And the answer is 1. If no one's ever told you, young men, young women, the reality of the fact is you are one bad decision away from ruining your whole life. And the reality of the fact is most of us in this room who are older can name you at least one person, but probably more than one person, whose whole lives have been poisoned because they made one bad decision. Every decision matters. Every single one is important because that one bad decision will not be satisfied with that one bad decision, will it? Now I got to make another one. It's like lying. Lying is so easy to think about in terms of this because once I tell one lie, in order for me to continue on, what must I then do? I got to tell another one. Once I tell another one, what do I have to do? Tell another one. Once I tell another one, what do I have to do? And it just keeps going down the line. Gossip. Once someone labels me as a gossip, what must I continue to do in order to maintain that desire for self-worth of giving people information? I must therefore become a persistent, perpetual gossip. Right? Donuts. Once I eat one, what must I do? Eat 2. When I eat 2, what must I do? Eat 12. It just builds. Right? You pick your sin. That's how it works. It's not satisfied. Right? And then we're shocked when it's not satisfied and we feel empty. But what it wants to do is not just distort. And that's the second thing that Paul's going to move us towards in the passage. It goes from distortion to possession. Sin is not pleased with you believing for very long that you own it, because its desire is to rule and own you. You are the slave. It is the master. And now we get this popcorn list. It's an incredibly long list that goes through of all these things. And what you see is that the person gradually becomes more and more consumed. Your life exists so that you might either be consumed with or consumed by. Either your life is such that you are consumed with the glory and the holiness of God and the desire to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ, that I desire to look more and more like Christ. I desire to do more and more work of killing sin. I desire to look more like Jesus and less like the world. And I'm consumed with that. It becomes my consuming passion. Or I am consumed by the sin that I tolerate in my life. That's it. Consumed with, consumed by. The sins that I tolerate consume me. Don't believe that? Ask any addict. The sins that I tolerate consume me. Ask any person who has a lifetime track record of uncontrolled anger. My sin consumes me, causes damage to everyone and every relationship in my life, and leaves me alone. The bitterness, the resentment, those things will consume you and change you in ungodly, unholy sorts of ways if we tolerate them. And so he goes through this list, and we're supposed to see this picture of what happens. You know, the way it's supposed to be in the Christian life. Christ sets my identity. We talked a lot about last week, identity, who you are. You know who you are? You are not what you feel. You are not what you do. You are not your sin. If you are a Christian, you are child of God, purchased by God, seated at the table of God. Christ sets your identity, right? From Christ setting my identity, what's supposed to happen then is my life overflows with goodness, right? So from me having the confidence of being in Jesus, of being purchased and held by Jesus Christ, even though the world feels like it's falling apart, He's got me. From the understanding, the realization that I'm held, my life overflows with goodness, and the overflow of that goodness then pours out onto other people, and others get to hear the blessings that I've experienced in my life. That's how it's supposed to go. What Paul is showing is that what sin does is exactly the opposite. It works from sin and goes back to identity, because sin wants you to be identified by it. It wants you to find your identity in what you do. So look at what he does. He starts with, we're not going to go through each one of these individual sins right now, but look at what it says, verse 29. They were filled with all, and then he goes through all these, all right? The picture there of being filled with is like somebody screwing off the top of your head and pouring sin in, right? If you can imagine, this is that God gave them over. He gives you what you want. You want to sin? Sin. Go for it, right? He's going to let you run on down, and you're going to be continuously filled with, and then you get this list: unrighteousness, evil, maliciousness, wickedness. Well, then once we go from being filled, right, because God gives us over, sin then's never satisfied. It creates this insatiable hunger in my soul, right? And I constantly feed on sin, thinking that it's going to somehow satisfy me, and it just makes me hungry and hungry. It's like sitting in a rowboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean dying of thirst. I got a cup. I'm going to get some salt water and drink it. Is it going to make me less thirsty or more thirsty? More thirsty. That's what sin does. Whole time I'm drinking something that I think is going to satisfy my thirst, I'm literally dehydrating my own body, literally destroying myself. Right? And so it starts from there, and then the next thing you know, the mind overflows. And so they're full of this next set of sins. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, wit, maliciousness. All right? So you've got these things now that come into me, sin coming into me because I want it there. I tolerate it. It comes in, and what comes in flows out. Right? Whatever comes out of my heart is what was already, whatever comes out of my mouth is what was already in my heart. Right? What I say is a reflection of what's living in here. And so that pours outward. Well, then the next thing you know, you go from, look at what he says. So you've got verse 29. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evilness, covetousness, malice. Since they were filled with these things, they are now full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. And look at what he does in the next passage. They are. Do you see what happens? Sin is not satisfied until it becomes your identity. And so now they are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. It will become your identity. You go from being filled with these things to being these things. And so Paul lists for us 21 different things. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This is not all that you are, right? Like, if you're really thinking carefully and creatively, you might could come up with some new things to add to this list. Paul is not giving you this exhaustive list of all the sins. He's just showing how it works. It goes in, it fills you up, it flows out of you, and then you become it, right? And the cycle repeats over and over and over again. He wants us to see the pervasive nature of sin. Sin has poisoned everything and everyone. So when we talk about total depravity, that's what we mean. Sin has poisoned everything and rendered humanity totally unable of saving themselves. Why? Because humanity doesn't even want to save themselves. Right? God has given them over to what they wanted, and they're running in the directions they want to do that. And if you don't believe that, you probably need to go get to know some lost people. Humanity is given exactly what it wants. And so they continue on down this path. We don't mean that everything is totally 100% sinful. We don't even mean that everyone is totally 100% sinful. God in His restraining grace restrains people. He holds people back from being so destructive that they would poison everyone. I think you see in history a couple of times where you see just a glimpse of what it might look like where humanity was totally unrestrained. Right? We think of the really bad people in history, which we never put ourselves on that list, but we think of other bad people in history, right? And you see a picture of that. You can see moments in your own life where you can see the destructive nature of your sin, right? It doesn't mean that people are as bad as it gets. It means that God just gives them over and they keep getting worse, and that there is no hope apart from someone or something intervening in that process, and that is where the gospel comes in. But Paul wants us, before we get to the good news of the rest of the book of Romans, he wants us to get a glimpse just how bad people are. I said this yesterday with the family conference. I've really not met very many people. I think I said this last week too. I've really not met very many people who take their sin seriously enough. I've met a lot of people who don't take their sin seriously. I've also met a lot of people who take other people's sin seriously. One of those is standing right here. Right? I've met a lot of those people. But you to take your sin seriously enough. And that's what Paul is trying to do for us, is to get this, right? You know, Paul's also not saying that everybody who's a sinner is completely miserable. Right? At the end of the day, sin would not be so tempting if it was not pleasurable. Like, wouldn't it be awesome? You remember the little buzzer things that you used to put on, like, your hand when you were a kid? You shook somebody's hand, it shocked them, and you're like, ah! You know, wouldn't it be great if there was something like that on you, that every time you sinned, God just went, bzz. Like, you'd probably sin. Most of us would sin less. Some of us might enjoy that, but most of us would sin less, right? And so, you know, but that's not it, right? Sin is pleasurable in the moment. Otherwise, it's not tempting. Like, my temptations are not yours, right? I've never, not one time in my whole life, been tempted to overeat on broccoli. Right? It's just not a temptation for me. It might be a temptation for you. Praise the Lord. I want that. I'll take it, right? But the temptations that we have in our life are pleasurable in the moment. But what do they produce in us? Death, right? And we have to look at things with a long view. But we're so stuck on looking at our feet that we can miss that. So I'm also not saying that all sinners are miserable. I know some sinners who take it, they're pretty happy, right? And they might be pretty happy a long time. You know when they will not be happy? Judgment. Because the good news of Jesus Christ is not primarily to give you a better life here, or to make you happy here, or to give you some sort of earthly satisfaction. It's so that you might be declared righteous by God and thus be seated at the table of God in eternity. And sometimes, I'm just going to be quite honest with you, we struggle with happiness in the midst of that life, don't we? That's okay. God's grace lives in the struggle. But when we tolerate this, you would think, right? You think that Paul would just stop the passage here. Like, clearly, how much worse could it get than being completely full, like than being totally full of sin? So the point that it's overflowing at the top of my head and offending other people. Then we get to verse 32. It actually does get worse, because this is what humanity does. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give hearty approval to those who practice them. Right? So it's not enough for me to live in the mire and the pit of sin, to offend others by my sinfulness. I need to grab people and bring them with me and then clap all the way to hell. Right? And go, yay! We're all offending God, rebels to the will of God. That misery loves company. Like, the only thing better than being miserable by yourself is being miserable with someone else, that you might make them miserable. And that's what happens. At the height of our depravity, we don't just sin, we become sin evangelists. Like, it's not enough for me to gossip. Let's just take gossip. I can't gossip by myself, right? I mean, I can, but it doesn't have the same effect. I can stand in the mirror and tell myself all the juicy secrets, but it doesn't create the same effect. What must I have in order to gossip? I must have another willing person. So what did I just do? I just grabbed them and pulled them down with me. If I'm going to lie and manipulate the truth, I can't just lie myself. I must have someone who lets me go along with the manipulation of facts, and who probably isn't willing to confront me in the fact that I just told a lie. And so what does that person do? Gives hearty approval. But we don't like to be confronted in our sin. And maybe even worse than being confronted in our sin is having to confront someone else in their sin. But we must be careful to not tolerate sin. Sin is poison. It's deadly. It's evil. It's wicked. Right? In order for me to consistently overeat, I had this conversation sitting at the table yesterday with dear brothers and sisters who love me, and I said, I have to say out loud when I am tempted to change the way I eat. When I'm tempted to go back to my old habits of eating, I have got to say it out loud. And the reason I have got to say it out loud is because I need to say it to people who love me enough to not go, oh, it's okay, you've had a good week, you've done really great, and immediately try to start justifying my behavior. I need people that go, oh, wow, okay. And at least that, if not, hey, let's pray for you, because we all need that. I've got to have that sense of community in order for me to kill sin in my life, and so do you. All right, we've got to have people in our lives that we say, I don't want to sin like this anymore, but I need to tell you so that I can have some help. And then when we hear that, when by God's grace those words come into our ears and into our brains, you got to do something about it. You can't leave that person hanging out there in outer space. They're saying, I need help with my sin. Help them. That's what the church does. That sounds so crazy, doesn't it? I don't know very many churches that do that. How about let's just break the mold and be a church that does that? Right? Most of the time, we just tolerate sin because we don't want to rock the boat. Listen, the boat is rocking. You understand? When you say that most of the time, the reason you don't feel the boat rocking is because you got your sinful sea legs on. Right? So I've just gotten so used to the feeling of the boat rocking that I don't realize that it's rocking anymore. But sin will not be satisfied with just poisoning and destroying you. It wants you to get so comfortable and accepting of it that it then comes out of you so that you might poison and destroy other people. It's this horrible contagion. And that's what Paul wants us to see. At the very height of our depravity, it poisons us to the point that we'll finally get to calling evil good and good evil. And we see this all over in the culture, don't we? But we see it in the church. We see it in our own lives. The destructive power of misplaced affections. The destruction that comes when we harbor bitterness and resentment, when we allow little sins to continue on for the rest of our lives, will ultimately destroy us and will cause us to bring other people down into the mire with us. So, I go back to the original question. What's wrong with the little sins? Boy, Paul's got a lot. That little sin that you desire to commit will lead to big problems, right? Because is there such thing as a little sin with God? No. Are some sins bigger than others? Yes, I've made that clear. But are all sins grievous? Are all sins worthy of death? Yes, because the one part that we haven't looked at in this passage yet is the beginning of verse 32. Look at this. Verse 32. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. Now, what are the such things? The 21 things that he just said prior. Now, let me ask you a question, friends. Let me ask you this. Let's go back to the beginning of this list. I said we're going to save the list. Have you ever done anything that anyone would consider unrighteous? Yeah, you deserve to die. Have you ever done anything that someone else or that God himself would say is evil? You deserve to die. Have you ever been covetous? Have you ever desired what someone had and wanted them to not have it? You deserve to die. Have you ever done something that someone would just say is malicious? Have you done harm to someone just for the sake of doing harm to them? You deserve to die. Have you ever been envious? You deserve to die. Have you ever murdered somebody? Now hold up. Most of us would go, no. Let's remember Jesus, who says that if you've held anger in your heart against your brother, then you have murdered them already. Most of us murdered our family this week. You deserve to die. Have you ever intentionally picked a fight with somebody just for the sake of picking a fight with them and thus been a person of strife? You deserve to die. By the way, that also includes Facebook fights. Right? Have you ever been deceitful? Have you ever manipulated an outcome, told a false truth in order to look good or to get your way? You deserve to die. Have you ever been a gossip? Have you ever heard someone say something, intentionally desiring to put that person in a bad light so that you might be put in a good light for having some sort of information? Either the giving or receiving of that, you deserve to die. Have you ever been a slanderer? We talked about slander this morning in Sunday school, that slander is speaking against someone in a negative way and in a public sort of way. It's not just saying things that are untrue. Sometimes we could say very true things in very mean ways, and that's slander. You deserve to die. Have you ever hated God? In other words, have you ever sinned? You deserve to die. You ever been insolent or haughty, boastful? You ever been arrogant? You ever thought better of yourself than you do of other people? You deserve to die. Have you ever been disobedient to your parents? Boy, every adult in this room better start doing this, right? What does the Bible say? Isn't that fascinating? In the midst of this list, what does he stop with? Disobedient to parents. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one is because there is a commandment to honor your mother and father. And there's a promise that you may live long in the land that I've given you, right? It's in there for sure. But another one is because I think Paul just wanted to be sure all of us understood the message that he's giving us. You've ever disobeyed your parents? You deserve to die. Have you ever been foolish? You deserve to die. Have you ever been faithless? You ever had moments where you just quite simply didn't even believe there was a God? I have. Deserve to die. Have you ever been heartless? Have you ever done something that was just mean? Said something, thought something that was just mean, not considering what it means to love your brother? You deserve to die. Have you ever been ruthless? Have you ever sought your own gain or advantage at the sake of another person's life or reputation? You deserve to die. Now, why am I saying all this? As Paul's wrapping all this up, and we get to Romans chapter 3 in one little phrase: the wages of sin is death. And it's easy for us to think about that when we don't think about our own sin, right? If you knew today, if you knew right now, this was the last day you were going to live on this earth and that you were going to be dead by the end of the day, how much different would your life be? Man, it'd be totally different. The sad part is that for most of us as Christians, we're going to immediately begin thinking of all the things we would do in this earth and not think about Jesus, who saved you, who gave you life. You were already dead, and He made you alive. That's what we celebrate this whole coming week with Easter. You were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, who is now at work in the sons of disobedience. You were one of them, dead. Dead, deserving more death, spiritual death. And God made you alive. So what's wrong with a little sin? Everything. You've been freed. Why would you live again in slavery? You don't have to manipulate outcomes to get people to like you. You've been declared righteous. Let the chips fall where they may. You don't have to gossip to get people to approve of you. You are declared righteous. Let the chips fall where they may. You don't have to eat more in order to find some sort of joy or peace. I'm preaching to myself for a second. So just deny yourself and look for in Jesus what you were looking for on your dinner plate. Be satisfied in the Jesus Christ that loves you, or you will never be satisfied. Not in a husband or a wife or a job or an education or a future. Because right now, Christian, right now, you deserve death and you got life. And that's the glory of Jesus Christ in the gospel. And we've been made alive. So how about we live like alive people and not dead people? So what do we do with this big old list? Do we just feel guilty about it? No, but we do take sin seriously. My favorite quote that I quote all the time, John Owen: be about the business of killing sin, or sin will be about the business of killing you. You are already at war. I'm not going to tell you to go to war. I'm going to tell you to fight in the war you've been commissioned to fight in. You don't decide to go to war. The war has come. It's here. It's on you. The war for your own soul, the war for your family's soul, men, is dependent upon our obedience and our desire to kill sin in our lives. And so let's kill it. That's what Paul wants us to get to at the end of Romans 1. Not feeling bad about ourselves. Right? My self-pity has accomplished nothing good in my life. I got to look past myself and look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of my faith, who, though I deserve condemnation, did not condemn me. And So I must take sin seriously in my own life and desire to be free from all sin, including the little respectable ones that I've been getting away with for years. As I come to church and I look nice and I dress pretty. Kill them! Put them to death because they're killing you and they're killing the people around you. War. That's what we're at. And so I think the second application point is just like the first one, which is take sin seriously. In other words, we have to take it seriously in the lives of other people too. I just got two quick illustrations that'll give you a handle on how hard this is. I could have picked a whole bunch of them. I just picked two. Number one, parents. How hard is it to be a consistent parent? How easy is it to get to the end of a long, hard day and be tired and see your child disobey and just kind of let it go because you're just too tired to deal with it? Maybe you guys don't do that. I've done this. This is a thing that we're all prone to do, right? But understand, Paul put this sin in this list for a reason, that we must be careful. When we allow the disobedience in our children's lives to go by and not say anything, you are not only doing sin, but you are giving hearty approval to others who sin. And setting our children on a path where they can believe that a little disobedience is okay if you're tired. Boy, that raises the bar some, right? That's the point. We've got to raise the bar to the point that only grace can get us over. But understand, there's a warning implicit in this. Like in terms of us, the way we raise our children matters. The things that we raise them to value matters. The way that we discipline them matters. I say often, you want to show me that you hate your children? Just don't discipline them. Let them get away with stuff. I'll know you love yourself more than you love them. Right? And every kid in the room is going, but we cannot, right? We are reflecting to them a God who looks at you and says, you deserved death and I gave you life. How easy is it when we go to work tomorrow morning to hear the guys around the water cooler or whatever, pick it, saying a few things that, might get a good chuckle but are completely wretched. And we allow not only do we allow them, we just kind of laugh along with them. Because we can leave our church stuff at church and be a totally different person where it would work. How easy is it to go along with the ridicule and scorn? If we connect this to a quick class this morning. The ridicule and scorn that we see happening in social media toward people that maybe think or agree differently than us and get a good chuckle out of it at their expense. You have not only committed sin, you have given hearty approval to others who commit sin. And if you don't take that seriously, I got some serious good news for you about the gospel of Jesus Christ that has set you free to be able to take that seriously. We're called to be a people who take sin seriously, even the little respectable ones that we've allowed to exist in church culture for hundreds of years. We didn't invent it, that's for sure, right? We're not the first generation to hide the ugly. But we got to bring it out and kill it. It must die. Or it will kill and poison us. The only way that happens is through exactly what we're coming back next week to celebrate, which is the glorious resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was raised so that we would be raised. He defeated death and hell and sin so that we might have it defeated for us and that we might be about the business of killing it in our own lives daily. You didn't just get saved so you could go to heaven when you die. You were saved so that you might trust, depend on Jesus, and rely on Him for the rest of your life and be changed to His image. And the only way to do that is by daily just confessing your need for Christ. Man, if you get to the end of chapter 1 and you don't feel deep down in your bones how very desperately you and I need the gospel of Jesus Christ, then we should read it again. It's supposed to point us to our desperate need and the good news. All of this comes after Paul says what? I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe. Powerful enough to kill the little sins in our lives.